The nursing home smelled of boiled carrots and industrial bleach. It was the kind of smell that settled into your clothes, your hair, your skin, until you couldn't tell where the building ended and you began. Eleanor Whitfield sat in a vinyl recliner beside the only window in room 214, watching a pair of cardinals hop along the branch of a dogwood tree in the courtyard below. She was 78 years old. Her hands, still strong, still steady, rested on the armrests of a chair that wasn't hers, in a room she had never chosen, in a building she had been brought to like a piece of furniture no one wanted anymore. 6 months ago, Eleanor had been living in her own house. A modest colonial on Beckett Lane in Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, the house she and her late husband, Walter, had purchased in 1972 for $11,000. She had raised 3 children inside those walls. She had repainted the kitchen cabinets 4 times over 5 decades, each color marking a different chapter of her life. Cream when the children were small, cobalt blue during the years Walter was stationed overseas, sage green when the grandchildren started coming, and finally, a warm terracotta the year Walter died, because he had always said he wanted to retire to a house that looked like Tuscany, and painting the cabinets was the closest she could get. The house was paid off. The property taxes were manageable. Eleanor drove herself to the grocery store every Thursday, attended the Methodist church on Sundays, and kept a vegetable garden in the backyard that produced more tomatoes than any one woman could reasonably eat. She gave the extras to her neighbor, Dolores, who made salsa and brought jars of it back tied with gingham ribbon. Then she fell. It was nothing dramatic. A wet patch on the kitchen floor from a leaking faucet she had been meaning to call a plumber about. Her right hip hit the linoleum with a crack that turned out to be a hairline fracture, painful but treatable. She spent 4 days in Jefferson Memorial Hospital and was released with a walker, a prescription for physical therapy, and instructions to take it easy for 6 weeks. But her eldest son, Gerald, had other plans. Gerald Whitfield was 54 years old, a real estate developer in Northern Virginia who wore Italian loafers and spoke about everything in terms of return on investment. He had driven down from Fairfax the day after the fall, not to sit with his mother, not to bring her flowers, but to meet privately with her physician and then with an elder law attorney whose office was conveniently located 2 blocks from the hospital. Eleanor didn't learn what Gerald had done until the day she was discharged. He was waiting for her in the hospital lobby with his younger sister, Karen, and their brother, Dennis. Karen was holding a brochure for Sycamore Ridge Assisted Living. Dennis was holding a clipboard with documents already flagged for signature. "Mom, we need to talk about the house," Gerald had said, guiding her into a wheelchair she didn't need, his hand on her shoulder like a clamp. What followed was the most efficiently executed betrayal Eleanor had ever witnessed. Gerald had obtained a temporary medical power of attorney during her hospitalization, citing her fall as evidence of cognitive and physical decline. He had already contacted a realtor. The house on Beckett Lane was listed at $210,000, priced to sell fast. Her car, a 2011 Honda Accord with 62,000 miles, was traded in for $4,000. Her savings account, which held $38,000 accumulated over decades of Walter's pension and her own careful frugality, was transferred into a joint account with Gerald's name on it, ostensibly to manage her care expenses. Within 3 weeks, Eleanor Whitfield owned nothing. The house sold in 9 days to a young couple who would never know that the terracotta cabinets had been painted by a woman who loved a man she could no longer hold. Her furniture was sold at an estate sale that Eleanor was not invited to attend. Her photo albums, her sewing machine, her collection of porcelain birds that Walter had given her one at a time on every wedding anniversary for 41 years, all of it dispersed into the hands of strangers carrying $20 bills and looking for bargains. "It's for your own safety, Mom," Karen had said, smoothing the thin blanket on the bed at Sycamore Ridge. "You can't live alone anymore. What if you fall again and nobody finds you?" "I had a phone," Eleanor replied quietly. "I had neighbors. I had a life." "You had a leaking faucet and a cracked hip," Gerald said from the doorway, already checking his watch. "This is the responsible thing to do. The responsible thing." Eleanor turned that phrase over in her mind every morning when she woke to the sound of a cart rattling down the hallway, carrying trays of lukewarm oatmeal and cups of applesauce to people who had once run households and businesses and raised families and built things with their hands. Now they sat in vinyl recliners and waited to be told when to eat. Eleanor's room at Sycamore Ridge cost $4,200 a month. Gerald paid it from the joint account, which meant he paid it from Eleanor's own money. He visited once a month, always on a Sunday, always for exactly 45 minutes. Karen called on Wednesdays. Dennis had stopped calling entirely by the second month. The staff at Sycamore Ridge were not unkind, but they were overworked and underpaid, and the building itself was a monument to the bare minimum. The hallways were wide enough for 2 wheelchairs to pass, but too narrow for dignity. The food was edible, but never good. The activities calendar featured bingo on Tuesdays, a movie on Fridays, and a visiting therapy dog named Chester on the first Saturday of every month. Chester was the highlight. Eleanor did not complain. She did not cry where anyone could see her. She sat in her vinyl recliner and watched the Cardinals and thought about the one thing Gerald and Karen and Dennis had not taken from her, because none of them knew it existed. In a fireproof lockbox she had hidden inside her pillowcase the morning the ambulance came, a lockbox small enough to hold in one hand, Eleanor kept 3 items. A faded black and white photograph of her mother, Vivian, standing in front of a stone farmhouse in the Appalachian foothills. A tarnished brass skeleton key, 3 inches long, with a bow shaped like a clover, and a single sheet of onion skin paper, folded into quarters, bearing her mother's handwriting in faded blue ink. The note read, "The cellar stays sealed until the world forgets. Then you open it. Only you." Vivian Hartwell had been dead for 31 years. She had lived her entire adult life on a 40-acre parcel of land in the hills above Lost Creek, West Virginia, a property so remote that the county assessor's office had valued it at $6,000 in 1993 and hadn't updated the appraisal since. The farmhouse had no running water, no electricity, and no road access after the logging trail washed out in the flood of 2004. It was, by every measurable standard, worthless. Gerald knew it existed. He had dismissed it in a single sentence during the estate meeting with the elder law attorney. There's some backwoods acreage in Pocahontas County. No utilities, no access. Not worth the cost of a survey. He was wrong. But Eleanor said nothing. She sat in her vinyl recliner and held the brass key inside her closed fist and waited. She waited for 3 months. She waited until Gerald's visits dropped from monthly to bi-monthly. She waited until Karen stopped asking how she was doing and started asking whether she needed anything from the dollar store, which was easier to answer and required less emotional investment. She waited until the staff at Sycamore Ridge had settled into the comfortable assumption that Eleanor Whitfield was a quiet, cooperative resident who never caused trouble and never would. On the morning of October the 14th, a Thursday, Eleanor put on her walking shoes, tucked the lockbox into the deep pocket of her winter coat, and walked out the front door of Sycamore Ridge Assisted Living at 7:15 in the morning, during the shift change when the front desk was unmanned for exactly 12 minutes. She walked 6 blocks to the Greyhound station on Route 340. She bought a one-way ticket to Marlinton, West Virginia, using $47 in cash she had hidden inside the lining of her coat for exactly this purpose. She boarded the 8:05 bus without looking back. The bus ride took 4 hours. Eleanor sat in a window seat near the back, watching the landscape shift from the tidy suburban sprawl of the eastern panhandle into the deep, folded green of the Allegheny Mountains. The trees were turning. Maples blazed in shades of amber and crimson against the dark shoulders of the ridges, and the rivers that threaded through the valleys ran cold and clear over beds of pale stone. She hadn't been to Lost Creek since the autumn after her mother died. That was in 1994. She had driven up with Walter to close the farmhouse for what she assumed would be the last time. They had boarded the windows, drained the pipes, and padlocked the front door. Walter had suggested selling the land, but Eleanor had refused. She couldn't explain why. Something in her mother's voice, something in the way Vivian had pressed the brass key into Eleanor's hand on her deathbed, told her that the 40 acres above Lost Creek were not hers to sell. They were hers to keep. So she kept them. She paid the property taxes every year, never more than $80, mailed in a check to the Pocahontas County Treasurer's office like clockwork. Gerald didn't know about the checks. Karen didn't know about the checks. The property existed in a bureaucratic blind spot, too small to matter, too remote to notice, owned by a woman everyone had decided couldn't take care of herself. In Marlinton, Eleanor stepped off the bus into air that tasted of wood smoke and cold creek water. She stood on the sidewalk outside the gas station, her winter coat buttoned to her chin, the lockbox heavy in her pocket, and considered her options. The farmhouse was 23 miles from town, the last 8 of which were impassable by car. She walked into the gas station and asked the young man behind the counter if anyone in town had a truck and a willingness to drive an old woman up a mountain road that didn't technically exist anymore. The young man's name was Clay Bosley. He was 26, broad-shouldered, with the kind of open, unhurried face that people in cities had forgotten how to make. He listened to Eleanor's request without interrupting, then said, "My granddad used to hunt up near Lost Creek. I know the trail. But ma'am, there's nothing up there. That hollow's been empty since I was a kid." "There's a house," Eleanor said. "There's a ruin," Clay corrected gently. "I've seen it from a distance. Roof's probably caved in by now." "Then I need to see it for myself." Clay studied her for a long moment. Whatever he saw in her face, the quiet steel behind the lined skin and the careful eyes, it was enough. He pulled his keys from his pocket and nodded toward a mud-caked Chevrolet pickup parked beside the air pump. "I'll take you up. No charge. But if the road's washed out past the second ford, we're walking." They drove in companionable silence. The paved road gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to a rutted track that wound through stands of hemlock and white oak so thick the canopy formed a tunnel. Clay's truck growled and lurched over rocks and root heaves, the suspension protesting every quarter mile. Eleanor gripped the door handle and said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the ridgeline ahead. The road ended at a creek crossing where the water ran shin-deep over a bed of flat shale. Clay parked the truck and they continued on foot, following a footpath that Eleanor's body remembered even though her mind had tried to forget. The air grew colder as they climbed. Mist clung to the hollows between the ridges, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant, mournful call of a pileated woodpecker somewhere in the canopy. When the farmhouse appeared through the trees, Eleanor stopped walking. It was still standing. The roof had not caved in. One corner sagged badly, and the chimney had lost its top 3 courses of stone, but the walls were solid, built from hand-cut sandstone blocks that Vivian's father had quarried from the ridge behind the house in 1921. The windows were dark, still boarded from the inside with the plywood Eleanor and Walter had nailed up 30 years ago. The front porch had collapsed on the left side, but the right side still held, the oak planks gray and weathered but intact. The padlock on the front door was rusted shut, fused into a single mass of corroded iron. Eleanor didn't bother with it. She walked around the side of the house to the root cellar entrance, a set of stone steps descending into the hillside, covered by a pair of heavy wooden doors laid flat against the earth. But the cellar doors were not just closed. They were sealed. Someone had poured concrete over the seam where the 2 doors met, a thick, deliberate line of morite that had hardened into stone over decades of freeze and thaw. The concrete was old, very old, cracked in places but still holding. On the surface of the right-hand door, scratched into the wood with something sharp, were 4 numbers. 1944. "What is that?" Clay asked, crouching beside her. He ran his fingers over the concrete seal. "My mother sealed this cellar the year my father shipped out to France," Eleanor said quietly. "He was with the 28th Infantry Division. He landed at Normandy and fought all the way to the Hurtgen Forest. He came home in 1945 with a Purple Heart and a piece of German shrapnel in his left knee that bothered him every winter for the rest of his life." "And the cellar?" "He never opened it. My mother told him she'd filled it with sand to keep the foundation stable. He believed her. He had no reason not to. But she told me the truth on the day she died." Clay looked at her. "What did she say?" Eleanor reached into her pocket and took out the brass key. It caught the thin mountain light and glowed like something ancient and alive. "She said the cellar stays sealed until the world forgets. Then I open it." Clay stood up. He looked at the sealed doors, then at Eleanor, then back at the doors. He was quiet for a long time. "I have a sledgehammer and a pry bar in the truck," he said. "Then I suggest you go get them." While Clay went back to the truck, Eleanor stood alone at the cellar entrance. The wind moved through the trees above her, rustling the last of the autumn leaves, and for a moment she could hear her mother's voice in the sound. Vivian Hartwell had been a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with hands roughened by decades of subsistence farming and a mind sharp enough to cut glass. She had been born in 1919 in the same house Eleanor was now standing beside. She had married, raised a daughter, buried a husband, and lived alone on this mountain for the last 26 years of her life, refusing every offer of help, every suggestion that she move to town, every implication that a woman her age had no business living alone in the wilderness. Eleanor understood now, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that her mother had not been stubborn. She had been standing guard. Clay returned with the sledgehammer and the pry bar and a headlamp strapped to his forehead. He assessed the concrete seal with the practiced eye of someone who had grown up tearing things apart and putting them back together. "This pour is at least 80 years old," he said, tapping the concrete with the head of the pry bar. "It's site and calcium. Whoever mixed it knew what they were doing. It's cracked from thermal cycling, but the bond is still strong. I can break it, but it's going to take some work." "Take your time," Eleanor said. She lowered herself onto a flat stone beside the cellar entrance, pulled her coat tight against the chill, and watched. Clay worked for nearly an hour. The sledgehammer rang against the concrete in a steady, percussive rhythm that echoed off the ridgeline and sent the woodpecker into indignant silence. Piece by piece, the seal crumbled. Chunks of gray concrete fell away, revealing the original wooden doors beneath, darkened with age but still solid. The wood was black walnut, Eleanor realized, the hardest, most rot-resistant timber in the Appalachian forest. Her mother had chosen it deliberately. When the last of the concrete was cleared, Clay wedged the pry bar into the seam between the two doors and leaned his full weight into it. The wood groaned. The iron hinges, buried in the stone frame, resisted with the stubbornness of 8 decades. Then, with a sound like a long-held breath finally released, the right-hand door swung upward and fell open against the hillside. A rush of air came up from below. It was cool and dry, carrying the scent of old timber, mineral dust, and something faintly sweet, like dried lavender or aged paper. It was not the smell of rot or standing water. It was the smell of a space that had been deliberately preserved. Clay aimed his headlamp down the stone steps. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on a floor of packed earth, swept clean, as if someone had tidied it the day before sealing the doors shut. "After you," Clay said, but his voice had lost its casual ease. There was something reverential in the air now, something that made both of them instinctively lower their voices. Eleanor took the brass key from her pocket. She did not know yet what it opened, but she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had lost everything and walked out of her own cage to stand on this mountain, that whatever Vivian Hartwell had sealed beneath the earth in 1944 had been waiting for this exact moment. She descended the stone steps into the dark. The stone steps were steep and narrow, cut directly into the bedrock of the hillside. Eleanor counted 12 of them, each one worn smooth by the feet of generations who had descended into this space long before her mother sealed it shut. She kept one hand on the cold stone wall for balance, and with each step the light from the open door above grew thinner, until the only illumination was the bobbing cone of Clay's headlamp behind her. At the bottom, the ceiling opened up. Eleanor had expected a cramped root cellar, the kind dug into every Appalachian hillside for storing potatoes and canned preserves through the winter. What she found instead was a room far larger than the footprint of the house above suggested. The walls were lined with hand-laid stone, the same sandstone blocks as the farmhouse, fitted so precisely that even after 80 years there was no sign of shifting or collapse. The floor was hard-packed earth, dry as bone. The ceiling was supported by heavy beams of black walnut, the same timber as the cellar doors, and they showed no rot, no insect damage, nothing. The air was cool and perfectly still, somewhere around 55 degrees, the natural temperature of deep earth in the central Appalachians. "This isn't a root cellar," Clay said softly, sweeping his headlamp across the space. "This is a vault. Somebody engineered this. The drainage, the ventilation, the timber selection. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing." Eleanor didn't answer. She was standing perfectly still in the center of the room, staring at what the light had revealed. Against the far wall, stacked in rigid, careful rows, were dozens of wooden crates. They were not the rough pine boxes used for shipping apples or ammunition. These were finely constructed, with dovetail joints and recessed brass hardware. Each one was stamped on the side with black stenciled letters, some in English, some in German, and some in French. The stencils were faded but legible. Eleanor stepped closer and read the nearest crate. It said, Hartwell, Strasbourg, 1943, handle with extreme care. To the left of the crates, resting on a long wooden workbench built against the stone wall, were objects wrapped individually in layers of oilcloth and unbleached muslin. There were perhaps 30 of them, each one tied with twine and labeled with a small paper tag in handwriting Eleanor recognized immediately as her mother's. And in the far corner of the room, sitting on a simple wooden chair beside a small writing desk, was a leather satchel. It was closed with a brass buckle, and hanging from the buckle by a short length of cord was a tag that read, in Vivian's hand, for Eleanor. Read this first. Eleanor crossed the room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She unclasped the satchel with trembling fingers and pulled out a thick sheaf of papers bound with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath the papers was a second leather journal, smaller than the sheaf, its cover embossed with the initials V.H. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first page. It was a letter written in her mother's careful, slanting hand, dated the 11th of March, 1993, 1 year before Vivian's death. My dearest Eleanor, the letter began. If you are reading this, then the world has forgotten, and it is time. I have carried this burden alone for nearly 50 years, and I am tired. But I was never sorry. What is in this room is not stolen. It was saved, and now it is yours to decide what to do with. Eleanor lowered herself onto the wooden chair, the leather satchel in her lap, and read. The story Vivian told in that letter was one Eleanor had never heard, not in 47 years of sitting at her mother's kitchen table, not in the long afternoons of shelling beans on the porch, not even in the final days when Vivian lay in the hospital bed Eleanor had set up in the living room because her mother refused to die anywhere but in her own house. Vivian Hartwell had not spent the war years on this mountain, waiting for her husband to come home. She had spent them working. In 1942, at the age of 23, Vivian had been recruited by the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, through a professor at the Women's College in Lewisburg, where she had completed 2 years of study before the money ran out. The professor had recognized something in Vivian that the other students lacked, a facility with languages. Vivian spoke fluent German, inherited from her maternal grandmother who had emigrated from Bavaria in 1898, and passable French, learned from a set of Berlitz records she had ordered through the mail. The OSS needed women who could translate intercepted communications, and Vivian was exactly what they were looking for. She was sent to Washington, then to London, and finally, in the winter of 1943, to a forward operating post in liberated Strasbourg, where her unit worked alongside a small, dedicated team of Allied specialists whose mission had nothing to do with combat. They were tasked with locating, cataloging, and securing works of art and cultural artifacts that the Nazi regime had systematically looted from museums, churches, private collections, and Jewish families across occupied Europe. Vivian's letter described what she had witnessed with the clinical precision of a woman who had spent 50 years processing the memory. The warehouses full of paintings stripped from their frames and stacked like cordwood. The crates of silver liturgical objects melted down for bullion. The libraries burned. The private collections of families who had been sent to the camps, their Rembrandts and Vermeers, and illuminated manuscripts seized as spoils of war and funneled into the personal hoards of Nazi officers or earmarked for Hitler's planned Führermuseum in Linz. Vivian's unit had recovered hundreds of items. Most were sent through official channels to central collection points in Munich and Wiesbaden, where the painstaking process of restitution to rightful owners was meant to begin. But Vivian had seen what happened to some of those items once they entered the official pipeline. She had watched officers skim pieces for themselves. She had seen bureaucrats reclassify rightful claims as unlocatable owners so that valuable works could be quietly diverted to private buyers or kept in government storage indefinitely. She had filed reports that were ignored and raised objections that were silenced. In the final months of the war, Vivian made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She diverted 27 items from the official recovery pipeline. She did not take them for herself. She took them because she knew who they belonged to, and she knew that if they entered the system, they would never reach their rightful owners. Working with a network of sympathetic servicemen and transport officers, she arranged for the items to be shipped home in military freight, disguised as personal effects, routed to an address in West Virginia that no one in Washington would ever think to audit. The crates arrived at the farmhouse in the autumn of 1944, while Vivian's husband was fighting in the Hurtgen forest. Vivian carried them into the cellar alone, one by one, down the 12 stone steps. She lined the walls with them. She wrapped the most fragile pieces individually in oilcloth and muslin. She built the writing desk and the chair herself, because she knew she would spend years sitting in this room, keeping watch. Then she mixed the concrete, sealed the cellar doors, and scratched the year into the wood so she would never forget the weight of what she had done. Eleanor set the letter down. Her hands were shaking so badly the pages rattled against the desk. She looked up at the rows of crates, at the wrapped bundles on the workbench, at the room her mother had built and guarded in absolute secrecy for half a century. "Mrs. Whitfield," Clay's voice came from somewhere behind her. He had been standing near the stairs, giving her space, but the expression on her face must have alarmed him. "Are you all right?" "My mother was a spy," Eleanor whispered. The words sounded absurd in the cold silence of the cellar, but there was no other way to say it. "She worked for the OSS during the war. She saved things. Art. She saved art that the Nazis stole, and she brought it here because she didn't trust the people who were supposed to give it back." Clay stared at her. Then he looked at the crates. Then he looked back at her. "You're telling me those boxes are full of Nazi-looted artwork that's been sitting under this mountain since 1944? "That's what her letter says." Clay let out a long, slow breath. He pulled off his headlamp and held it in his hand, as if the weight of what she had just told him required both feet firmly planted and nothing strapped to his head. "Can we open one?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated. Then she stood, crossed the room to the nearest crate, and examined its brass latches. They were tarnished green with age, but still functional. She reached into her pocket and took out the brass skeleton key. The clover-shaped bow caught the light from Clay's headlamp, and Eleanor noticed for the first time that each crate had a small brass lock set into its front panel, the same size and shape as the key in her hand. She inserted the key. It turned with a smooth, precise click, as if the lock had been oiled yesterday. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in a bed of straw and cotton batting that had yellowed with age but still held its shape, was a painting. It was small, perhaps 14 inches by 18, framed in a simple gilt wood border. The surface of the canvas was dark, rich, layered with the unmistakable texture of oil paint applied by a hand that understood light the way a musician understands silence. It depicted a young woman seated at a table near a window. The light from the window fell across her face and hands with a luminous, almost liquid quality. She was reading a letter. Her expression was private, absorbed, unaware of the viewer. The background was a deep, warm umber, and the folds of her blue dress caught the light in a way that made the fabric seem to breathe. Eleanor knew nothing about art. She had never been to a museum. She had never taken an art history class. But she knew, with an instinct that bypassed education entirely and spoke directly to something deep and primal in her chest, that she was looking at something extraordinary. "That's not a reproduction," Clay said. He had moved closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know anything about paintings, Mrs. Whitfield, but that is not a print." Eleanor looked at the paper tag attached to the frame with a loop of twine. In her mother's handwriting, it read, "Vermeer School, Provenance, Rothstein family, Amsterdam, seized 1941. Return to family if located." She closed the lid carefully, pressing it down until the latch clicked. Then she moved to the workbench. She untied the twine on the first wrapped bundle and carefully peeled back the layers of muslin and oilcloth. Inside was a small wooden box, ornately carved, containing a set of silver kiddush cups. The paper tag read, "Judaica, Provenance, Goldfarb family, Vienna, seized 1938. 6 cups, hallmarked, 18th century." The second bundle contained a leather portfolio of watercolors, each one separated by sheets of acid-free tissue paper that Vivian must have purchased and inserted herself. The tag read, "Attributed Dürer Workshop, Provenance, Landesmuseum Mainz, looted 1940. The third was a small bronze sculpture, a reclining figure, modernist in style, smooth and heavy in Eleanor's hands. Lembruck, the tag read. Provenance, private collection, Dr. Samuel Weil, Berlin. Family deported Auschwitz, 1942. No known survivors. Eleanor set the bronze down on the workbench with exquisite care, as if it were made of glass. She stood there with her hands at her sides, looking at the rows of crates she had not yet opened, at the bundles she had not yet unwrapped, and the full weight of what her mother had done settled onto her shoulders like a physical force. Vivian Hartwell had not hidden treasure. She had hidden people's lives. Every object in this room had been torn from a family, a home, a culture, a history, by a machine of organized cruelty, and Vivian had carried them across an ocean and buried them under a mountain because she believed, with the kind of faith that sustains a person through 50 years of solitary guardianship, that someday the world would be ready to give them back. Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the cool stone wall of the cellar and closed her eyes. She thought about her room at Sycamore Ridge. She thought about Gerald's hand on her shoulder like a clamp. She thought about her porcelain bird sold to strangers for pocket change. She thought about the look on Karen's face when she smoothed the thin blanket on the bed, the performance of care from a daughter who had already decided her mother was finished. And she thought about Vivian, 5 feet tall, hands rough from farming, a woman who had outwitted the bureaucracies of 2 governments, carried priceless artwork down 12 stone steps by herself, and kept the secret for half a century without once asking for recognition or reward. Mrs. Whitfield, Clay said gently, we need to talk about what happens next. Eleanor opened her eyes. Yes, she said. We do. They climbed back up the stone steps into the thin October sunlight. The air outside felt impossibly fresh after the sealed stillness of the cellar. Eleanor sat on the flat stone beside the entrance, and Clay sat on the ground across from her, his back against a hemlock trunk. I'm going to say something, and I don't want you to take it the wrong way, Clay said. But what's down there? If those are what your mother's tags say they are, we're talking about objects that belong in museums. We're talking about items that governments and families have been looking for since 1945. The legal situation alone is going to be incredibly complicated. I know. And there are people who would do very ugly things to get their hands on what's in that cellar. I know that too. So what do you want to do? Eleanor looked down at the brass key in her hand. She turned it over slowly, feeling the weight of it, the warmth it had absorbed from her body over the months she had carried it hidden in her pillowcase at Sycamore Ridge. My mother's instructions were clear, Eleanor said. She saved these things so they could be returned. Every tag has a name, a family, a place of origin. She wanted them to go home. That's going to require experts, lawyers, provenance researchers, probably the FBI's Art Crimes Division. Then we contact them. From where? You walked out of a nursing home this morning, Mrs. Whitfield. With all due respect, your son has power of attorney over your affairs. If Gerald finds out where you are before you've established legal standing over this property and what's inside it, he could shut this whole thing down. He could claim the contents as part of your estate, which he controls. The truth of Clay's words hit Eleanor like a stone dropped into still water. She had escaped one cage, but the bars Gerald had built around her legal existence were still intact. As far as the state of West Virginia was concerned, Eleanor Whitfield was a vulnerable adult under the care and financial management of her eldest son. She had no bank account in her own name. She had no car. She had no phone. She had walked out of a licensed care facility without authorization, which meant that by now, someone had almost certainly called Gerald. How long do I have before they come looking? Eleanor asked. Clay checked his watch. You left at 7:15 this morning. It's almost 3 now. If the facility called your son immediately, he's had about 7 hours to panic. But he'd be looking for you in Harper's Ferry, not up here. Unless someone in Marlinton saw us leave together. The woman at the gas station. Helen, Clay nodded. She knows my truck. She knows I drove up the mountain with an elderly woman. If anyone calls around asking, she'll tell them. Eleanor stood up. The decision crystallized in her mind with the same cold clarity that had guided her out the front door of Sycamore Ridge that morning. I need a lawyer, she said. Not Gerald's lawyer. My own. Someone who handles elder law and estate disputes. And I need them before Gerald gets here. I know someone, Clay said slowly. My cousin's wife, Angela Bosley. She practices in Lewisburg. Family law, estate law, guardianship disputes. She's good. She's honest. And she doesn't scare easy. Call her. Clay pulled out his phone, frowned at the screen, and shook his head. No signal up here. I'll have to drive down to the highway. 30 minutes each way. Then go. I'll stay here. Clay hesitated. He looked at the open cellar doors, then at Eleanor, then at the empty forest stretching in every direction. You sure you'll be all right up here alone? Eleanor almost smiled. I've been alone in a room full of strangers for 6 months, Clay. Being alone on my own mother's land is the first peace I've had since my hip healed. Clay nodded. He stood, brushed the dirt from his jeans, and headed back down the trail toward his truck. Eleanor listened to his footsteps fade into the forest until there was nothing left but the wind in the hemlocks and the distant sound of the creek running over stone below the ridge. She turned back to the open cellar. The darkness below was no longer frightening. It was familiar. It was hers. Eleanor descended the steps again. This time she moved with deliberate purpose. She went to the writing desk in the corner and opened the leather journal with her mother's initials on the cover. It was a detailed inventory, each page corresponding to one of the crates or wrapped bundles, listing the item, its estimated provenance, the family or institution it had been taken from, and, where Vivian had been able to determine it, the current status of the rightful owners or their descendants. Some entries were heartbreaking in their brevity. Menorah, silver, 19th century. Rosenblatt family, Krakow. No known survivors. Donate to Holocaust Memorial if no heirs located. Others were meticulous in their hope. Portrait, oil on canvas, attributed to Modigliani. Provenance, collection of Dr. Henri Laurent, Paris. Daughter Marie Laurent believed alive. Married name unknown. Last known address, Lyon, 1952. Searched through Red Cross International Tracing Service. Vivian had spent decades researching, writing letters, tracking down leads, all from this mountain, all in secret, all without ever removing a single item from the cellar. She had been building a restitution case, one entry at a time, for the day when someone she trusted would carry it forward. Eleanor ran her finger down the final page of the inventory. At the bottom, in handwriting that was shakier than the earlier entries, clearly written in Vivian's last years, was a single line. Total items cataloged, 27 individual works and collections. Estimated combined value at current market. Unknown, but the Vermeer alone, if authenticated, is beyond price. This is not about money. This is about returning what was taken. The seller holds their memory. Do not let it die here. Eleanor closed the journal. She held it against her chest the way she had once held her children when they were small enough to carry, before they grew into people who would carry her away instead. She sat in her mother's chair, in her mother's cellar, surrounded by the rescued lives of strangers her mother had never met, and waited for Clay to come back with help. The light from the open cellar doors shifted from gold to amber to a deep, bruised violet as the afternoon bled into evening. The temperature dropped. Eleanor pulled her winter coat tighter and listened to the mountain settle into its nightly silence. Somewhere above her, an owl began its low, questioning call, and she answered it in her mind the way her mother used to answer it aloud, with a soft hoot and a whispered reassurance that everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Clay's truck came grinding back up the mountain trail just as the last light disappeared behind the ridge. Eleanor heard it before she saw it, the engine straining against the grade, headlights cutting yellow tunnels through the dark canopy. She had climbed back up from the cellar and was sitting on the porch of the farmhouse, wrapped in a wool blanket she had found folded in one of the cedar chests inside the house. It smelled of her mother, lavender and loose-leaf tobacco, and something deeper, something that was simply Vivian. Clay wasn't alone. A woman stepped out of the passenger's side, tall, sharp-featured, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing mud-splattered boots that suggested she had dressed for the office but been redirected to a mountain. Angela Bosley had the kind of face that courtrooms learned to take seriously, composed, direct, with eyes that cataloged everything and gave away nothing. Mrs. Whitfield, Angela said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm and warm. Clay told me what you found. I need you to tell me everything from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. They sat on the porch in the dark, Eleanor's voice the only sound besides the creak and the wind. She told Angela about the fall, about Gerald's power of attorney, about the house on Beckett Lane sold out from under her, about the savings account transferred into Gerald's name, about the 6 months at Sycamore Ridge. She told her about the lockbox and the pillowcase, the brass key, the note from her mother. She told her about the sealed cellar, the crates, the wrapped bundles, the inventory journal, and the letter that explained everything Vivian Hartwell had done and why. Angela listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, the lawyer was quiet for a long time. "Here's where we stand," Angela said finally, her voice measured and precise. "The power of attorney Gerald obtained is temporary and was granted on medical grounds tied to your hip fracture. A hip fracture does not constitute cognitive impairment. You are lucid, articulate, and clearly capable of managing your own affairs. I can file an emergency motion to revoke the POA first thing tomorrow morning in Pocahontas County Circuit Court. Given the circumstances, I expect the judge will grant it." "And the property?" "The 40 acres are in your name. You've been paying taxes on them for 30 years. Gerald has no legal claim to this land or anything on it. The contents of the cellar are a more complicated question because we're dealing with items of potentially enormous historical and monetary value, items that may have competing claims from foreign governments, surviving families, and international restitution agencies. But the critical point is this: Gerald cannot touch any of it if we establish your legal autonomy before he petitions to extend his guardianship. Right now, the clock is in our favor, but only barely. What do you need from me?" "Your signature on 3 documents tonight. A formal revocation of the power of attorney, a declaration of competency, and a petition for emergency protective custody of the cellar contents pending federal assessment. I'll file everything electronically as soon as I get a cell signal on the drive back to Lewisburg. By 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, there will be a court order preventing Gerald or anyone else from accessing this property or its contents." Eleanor signed the documents on the hood of Clay's truck by flashlight. Her hand was steady. Angela witnessed each signature, photographed the documents, and placed the originals in her briefcase. "One more thing," Angela said, pausing at the truck door. "Clay mentioned the art. If even a fraction of what your mother cataloged is authentic, we're not talking about a local legal matter. We're talking about an international recovery of Holocaust-era cultural property. That means the FBI's art crime team, the State Department's Office of the Special Envoy for Holocaust Issues, and probably the Commission for Looted Art in Europe. This is going to get very big, very fast." "I understand. Are you prepared for that?" Eleanor looked at the dark shape of the farmhouse behind her, the open cellar doors, the mountain rising above it all into a sky full of stars that the lights of no city had ever reached. "My mother prepared for it," Eleanor said. "She spent 50 years getting ready. I just have to finish what she started." Angela nodded. She got into the truck. Clay rolled down his window. "I'll be back at first light with supplies," he said. "Food, water, a camp stove, and a padlock for those cellar doors. You sure you want to stay up here tonight?" "This is my house, Clay. I'm not leaving it again." She watched the taillights disappear down the mountain. Then she went inside, built a fire in the stone fireplace with which she found stacked under a tarp on the back porch, and slept on the old mattress in her mother's bedroom for the first time in 30 years. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, and woke to the sound of birds she hadn't heard since childhood. The next 72 hours unfolded with the kind of momentum that Eleanor had not experienced since the early years of her marriage, when life moved fast and every day brought something new. Angela filed the emergency motions at 8:45 the following morning. By 10, Judge Ruth Calloway of the Pocahontas County Circuit Court had signed an order revoking Gerald's temporary power of attorney, declaring Eleanor competent to manage her own affairs, and placing a protective hold on the Lost Creek property and all structures and contents therein. Gerald learned about the court order at 11:15, when his attorney in Fairfax called to inform him that his authority over his mother's affairs had been dissolved by a judge he had never heard of in a county he couldn't locate on a map. According to Angela, who heard the account secondhand from the court clerk, Gerald's first call was to Sycamore Ridge, where he was informed that his mother had walked out 3 days earlier and had not been located. His second call was to the Pocahontas County Sheriff's Office, demanding a welfare check on Eleanor at the Lost Creek property. His third call was to Angela's office, where he left a voicemail that Angela described to Eleanor as containing language that would have gotten him held in contempt if he had used it in a courtroom. Eleanor did not return any of Gerald's calls. She did not return Karen's calls either, though Karen left 3 messages in rapid succession, each one escalating from concerned to confused to indignant. Dennis did not call at all. What happened instead was that experts began arriving at the mountain. Angela had contacted the FBI's art crime team on the 2nd day, and by the 3rd day, 2 special agents from the Washington field office drove up the logging trail in a black SUV that looked profoundly out of place among the hemlocks. Agent Catherine Marsh was a specialist in Holocaust-era asset recovery. Her partner, Agent Dennis Yoon, handled chain-of-custody documentation. They were professional, respectful, and visibly stunned by what they found in the cellar. Agent Marsh descended the stone steps with white cotton gloves and a digital camera. She spent 4 hours in the cellar without coming up once. When she finally emerged, her face was flushed, and she asked to sit down before speaking. "Mrs. Whitfield," Agent Marsh said carefully, "I've been working art crime cases for 16 years. I've recovered paintings from drug lords' basements and sculptures from shipping containers in Rotterdam. I have never, in my career, encountered a private recovery cache of this magnitude. What can you tell me? Preliminary assessment only, but I can tell you this much. The painting in the first crate, the one your mother tagged as Vermeer School, is not Vermeer School. It's Vermeer. It's a previously unrecorded work, which means it's either a newly discovered original or it was deliberately suppressed from the catalog to facilitate its theft. Either way, if it's authenticated, we're looking at a painting worth somewhere between $70 and $150 million. Eleanor sat very still. The Judaica collection, the Kiddush cups, the menorah your mother tagged for the Rosenblatt family. Those are significant pieces of 18th century ceremonial silver. The watercolors attributed to the Dürer workshop will require laboratory analysis, but based on the paper quality and pigment characteristics I can see with the naked eye, they are consistent with genuine 15th century works. And the bronze, the Lembruck, is a known missing work. It's been on the art loss register since 1998. What does all of this mean? It means your mother was one of the most important private rescuers of looted art in the history of World War II, and nobody knew. It means this cellar is one of the most significant cultural discoveries on American soil in decades. And it means that the restitution process for these items is going to involve multiple countries, dozens of families, and years of legal and historical research. My mother wanted them returned, Eleanor said. She left instructions for every piece. Names, families, places of origin. Agent Marsh nodded slowly. Your mother's documentation is extraordinary. The level of detail in her inventory journal is better than what most national archives have. It's going to make the restitution process significantly faster and more precise. She didn't just save these objects, Mrs. Whitfield. She spent 50 years building the road map to bring them home. Over the following 2 weeks, the cellar was formally cataloged under FBI supervision. Each crate was opened, each bundle unwrapped, each item photographed, described, and entered into a secure federal database. The process was painstaking. Eleanor insisted on being present for every opening, sitting in her mother's chair with the leather journal in her lap, reading aloud Vivian's notes as each piece was revealed. The full inventory came to 27 distinct items and collections, exactly as Vivian's journal described. Among them were 4 oil paintings, including the suspected Vermeer, a small Renoir landscape, and 2 portraits by lesser-known but historically significant Dutch masters. There were 9 pieces of Judaica, including the Kiddush cups, the menorah, and a hand-illuminated Haggadah from the 17th century that an expert from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum described, in a phone call Eleanor overheard, as one of the most important surviving examples of its kind. There were the watercolors, the Lembruck bronze, a collection of antique maps and manuscripts, and a small wooden chest containing personal jewelry, wedding rings, lockets, and engraved watches that had been taken from families before their deportation. The jewelry was what broke Eleanor. Not the paintings, not the silver, not the works worth tens of millions of dollars. It was the small wooden chest of rings and lockets, each one engraved with names and dates that represented lives interrupted, loves severed, families destroyed. Vivian had tagged each piece with whatever identifying information she had been able to gather. Wedding band, inscribed S.L. to R.L. June 14, 1936. Locket containing photograph of 2 children, names unknown. Wristwatch, engraved, "To our beloved son, David." Eleanor held the chest on her lap and wept. She wept for the people who had worn these things. She wept for her mother, who had carried them across an ocean and guarded them in silence. And she wept for herself, for the 6 months she had spent in a vinyl recliner being told she was too old to matter, too frail to decide, too finished to be trusted with her own life. Clay built a temporary shelter over the cellar entrance to protect it from weather. He drove into town every day for supplies and brought Eleanor meals from Helen's diner. He never asked for payment. When Eleanor tried to press money into his hand, he shook his head and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I've spent my whole life in these mountains and never knew something like this was up here. You're giving me the best story I'll ever have. That's payment enough." The news broke on a Wednesday. Angela had worked with the FBI's Public Affairs Office to manage the announcement, and the story hit the National Wire services like a thunderclap. The New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, the BBC. A reclusive West Virginia farm woman had spent 50 years guarding a cellar full of art looted by the Nazis, and her 78-year-old daughter, recently displaced from a nursing home by her own children, had walked out of assisted living and up a mountain to unseal it. The story had everything: heroism, sacrifice, betrayal, redemption. Within 48 hours, it had been picked up by every major news outlet in the country. It was the betrayal angle that caught fire fastest. Reporters dug into Eleanor's circumstances. They found the records of the house sale on Beckett Lane, completed in 9 days at below market value. They found the transfer of Eleanor's savings into a joint account controlled by Gerald. They found the medical power of attorney obtained on the basis of a hip fracture with no cognitive component. They found the monthly invoices from Sycamore Ridge, paid with Eleanor's own money while she sat in a room she didn't choose, eating food she didn't want, watching cardinals through a window that didn't open all the way. Gerald Whitfield did not handle the attention well. He released a statement through his attorney describing Eleanor's departure from Sycamore Ridge as a cause for concern and asserting that his actions had been motivated solely by care for his mother's well-being. The statement was picked apart within hours by legal commentators who noted that Gerald had sold his mother's home without her written consent and had transferred her savings into an account bearing his name without an independent fiduciary review. Karen released her own statement, shorter and more emotional, expressing gratitude that her mother was safe and insisting that the family's decisions had been made with love. She did not explain why love had required selling the porcelain birds Walter had given Eleanor on every wedding anniversary for 41 years. Dennis said nothing. He had not spoken to Eleanor in 4 months. He would not speak to her for another 3. Eleanor did not respond to any of it publicly. She stayed on the mountain. She sat on the porch of the farmhouse in the mornings, drinking coffee that Clay brought up in a thermos, watching the mist burn off the valley below. She read her mother's journal from beginning to end, 3 times, memorizing the names of every family Vivian had tried to protect. She met with restitution researchers who had begun the process of tracing the rightful owners and their descendants. And then, on a cold afternoon in early November, Gerald drove up the mountain. He came alone. His Italian loafers were caked in mud by the time he reached the farmhouse, and his cashmere coat was snagged with burrs from the trailside brush. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at his mother, and for the first time in Eleanor's memory, Gerald Whitfield did not look like a man in control of anything. "Mom," he said. Eleanor regarded him from the porch. She was sitting in a rocking chair that Clay had carried up from town, the wool blanket across her lap, the brass key resting on the arm of the chair where she kept it always now, not hidden, not clutched, just resting in the open where it belonged. Gerald. He climbed the steps slowly, as if each one required a decision. He stood in front of her, his hands in his coat pockets, his jaw working around words he couldn't seem to assemble. "I saw the news," he said. "I expect you did. They're saying the collection could be worth $200 million. They're saying a lot of things." Gerald's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for Eleanor to see the boy he had been before he became the man who sold her house. His eyes were wet, and his voice, when it came, was stripped of the boardroom polish that usually armored it. "Why didn't you tell me? About the property, about Grandma Vivian, about any of this? If I had known, I never would have, we never would have." Eleanor let the silence hold for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines. A crow called from somewhere down the ridge. You never would have what, Gerald? You never would have taken my house. You never would have sold my things. You never would have put me in a room that smelled like bleach and called it care? Her voice was quiet, level, entirely without malice. It was worse than anger. It was clarity. You didn't do those things because you didn't know about the cellar. You did them because you decided I was finished. You looked at me, your mother, and you saw a liability. A line item. An asset to be liquidated and managed. Gerald opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Your grandmother spent 50 years sitting on this mountain, guarding the most important secret of her life, and the whole world thought she was crazy. My own daughter-in-law called her a hoarder at Thanksgiving dinner. Your Aunt Cynthia, God rest her, told anyone who would listen that Vivian had lost her mind. And your father, my Walter, the kindest man I ever knew, he never once questioned why I refused to sell this land. He just trusted me. He trusted that I had a reason, even when I couldn't tell him what it was. Eleanor picked up the brass key and held it in her open palm. This key was in my pillowcase for 6 months at Sycamore Ridge, Gerald. 6 months. You visited me 8 times. You never once asked what I kept in that pillowcase. You never once asked what I was thinking about when I sat by that window. You never once asked if I was happy, or if I was afraid, or if there was something I needed that wasn't on a medical chart. She closed her fingers around the key. You didn't sell my house because you didn't know about the cellar. You sold it because you never thought to ask what I might still be holding. Gerald sat down on the top step of the porch. He put his face in his hands. His shoulders shook, once, twice, and then he was still. Eleanor watched him without moving. She did not reach out to comfort him. She did not tell him it was all right. It was not all right. But she did not tell him it was unforgivable either, because Eleanor Whitfield had spent 78 years learning the difference between justice and cruelty, and she knew which one she wanted to carry forward. I'm not going to sue you, Eleanor said. Angela tells me I have grounds. The power of attorney was improperly obtained. The asset transfers were conducted without adequate oversight. I could recover the proceeds from the house sale, the savings, the value of everything you sold at that estate sale. But I'm not going to do that. Gerald looked up. His face was blotched and raw. Why not? Because your father wouldn't have wanted me to. And because I have more important work to do than punishing you for being small. She let that settle. Then she continued. What I'm going to do is this. The collection in that cellar belongs to the families it was stolen from. Every piece will be returned, authenticated, and restituted according to my mother's instructions. The process is already underway. The FBI is coordinating with restitution agencies in 6 countries. For the items whose families cannot be located, Vivian's instructions specify donation to Holocaust memorial institutions. I intend to honor every word. And you? What happens to you? Under the Federal Cultural Property Advisory Committee's guidelines, and according to Angela, the state's unclaimed cultural property statutes, I am entitled to a finder's recovery fee for items whose rightful owners cannot be located after a thorough search. Agent Marsh estimates that will apply to approximately 1/3 of the collection. The fee is substantial, more than enough to restore this farmhouse, to live independently for the rest of my life, and to establish a foundation in your grandmother's name. Eleanor paused. The Vivian Hartwell Foundation for Cultural Restitution. It will fund research into unrecovered looted art. It will employ provenance researchers. It will make sure that what Vivian did alone, in secret, on this mountain, continues long after I'm gone. Gerald stared at her. For the first time in his adult life, he appeared to understand that his mother was not a woman who needed to be managed. She was a woman who had been waiting, patiently, fiercely, for the right door to open. He left an hour later. He did not ask for forgiveness, and Eleanor did not offer it. But as he walked down the trail toward his mud-caked sedan, he stopped, turned back, and said, the terracotta cabinets. In the kitchen on Beckett Lane. I should never have let them paint over those. It was the only true thing he had said all day. In the weeks that followed Gerald's visit, the quiet consequences of his choices arrived the way weather arrives on a mountain, not all at once, but steadily, from every direction. His real estate firm in Fairfax lost 2 major clients who cited the news coverage as a concern about Gerald's character and judgment. A profile piece in the Washington Post's Metro section quoted a former colleague who said Gerald had always treated people like properties, assessing their value, deciding what to keep and what to demolish. Gerald's wife, Patricia, filed for legal separation in December. Eleanor heard about it from Angela, who heard about it from the court filings. Eleanor did not feel satisfaction. She felt the particular heaviness of watching a child you raised become a stranger you recognize only in glimpses, in the shape of his hands or the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, echoes of the boy who once sat on her kitchen floor stacking blocks and laughing when they fell. The community in Harper's Ferry responded as small towns do when a story like Eleanor's breaks. The neighbors on Beckett Lane, the ones who had watched the estate sale from their porches and said nothing, now told reporters they had always thought something wasn't right. Dolores, the neighbor who had traded tomatoes for salsa for 15 years, drove 3 hours to Marlinton and then hiked the last mile up the mountain to deliver a jar of salsa and an apology. She sat on the porch with Eleanor for 2 hours. They didn't talk about the cellar. They talked about the tomatoes and about Walter and about how some friendships survive silence because the roots go deep enough. The months that followed were the busiest and most purposeful of Eleanor's life. The farmhouse on Lost Creek was restored by Clay Bosley and a crew of local tradespeople who worked with the kind of care usually reserved for historic landmarks. The roof was repaired. Electricity and plumbing were installed for the first time. The stone walls were repointed. The porch was rebuilt with oak planks milled from timber harvested on the property, and a new rocking chair was placed beside the front door, facing east toward the sunrise. The cellar was professionally sealed with climate control systems installed by a conservation team from the Smithsonian, who treated the space with the same reverence they would have given a newly discovered Egyptian tomb. The 27 items were removed one by one, over the course of 3 weeks, transported under armed escort to secure facilities in Washington, where the long process of authentication and restitution began. The Vermeer was authenticated by a panel of 3 independent experts. It was a previously unknown work, painted around 1657, depicting a young woman reading a letter by a window. The panel's unanimous conclusion was published in the Burlington magazine, and the painting was valued at $120 million. It was ultimately restituted to the Rothstein family's descendants, a granddaughter living in Toronto and a great-nephew in Amsterdam, who had spent decades searching for the works stolen from their family's collection. At the restitution ceremony, held at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, the granddaughter, a woman named Miriam Rothstein Carr, approached Eleanor and took both of her hands. "Your mother saved my grandmother's favorite painting," Miriam said, her voice breaking. "My grandmother used to sit in front of it every evening." She said the woman in the painting was reading a letter from someone she loved, and that as long as the painting existed, the love in that letter was still alive. Eleanor held Miriam's hands and said nothing. There was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. 14 of the 27 items were successfully restituted to identified families or their descendants over the following 18 months. The Kiddush cups went to a branch of the Goldfarb family now, living in Israel. The Lembruck bronze was returned to the estate of Dr. Samuel Weil, whose great-grandchildren held a private ceremony in Berlin. The illuminated Haggadah was placed on permanent loan at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, with the Rosenblatt family's blessing, under a plaque that read, "Preserved by Vivian Hartwell, 1944 to 1993. Unsealed by her daughter, Eleanor Whitfield, 2024. The wooden chest of jewelry was the last to be processed. Each ring, each locket, each engraved watch was traced with painstaking care. 11 of the pieces were matched to surviving families. The wedding band inscribed S.L. to R.L. June 14, 1936, was returned to Ruth Lieberman's niece, a retired schoolteacher in London, who slipped it onto her finger and wore it for the rest of her life. For the items whose families could not be found, Eleanor established the Vivian Hartwell Foundation, funded by the recovery fees and by private donations that began arriving unsolicited after the story went public. The foundation hired its first provenance researcher within 6 months and its first full-time director within a year. Its offices were located not in Washington or New York, but in Lewisburg, West Virginia, 20 miles from the mountain where Vivian had kept her vigil. The recovery fee Eleanor received, after taxes and legal costs, amounted to just over $4 million. It was more money than she had ever imagined holding in her lifetime, and the first thing she did with it was pay off the balance of Walter's old pension loan, a debt of $1,200 that Gerald had never bothered to settle when he liquidated her accounts. It was a small, symbolic act, but it mattered to Eleanor. Walter's name deserved to be clean. She donated a significant portion to the foundation. She set aside enough to restore the farmhouse properly and to live comfortably, without luxury, but without worry, for however many years the mountain chose to give her. She opened a modest college savings account for each of her 4 grandchildren, children she had not seen in months, children whose parents had not brought them to Sycamore Ridge because the facility was depressing and the drive was long and there was always something else. The accounts were opened quietly, without announcement. Eleanor believed that generosity performed for an audience was not generosity. It was advertising. A documentary filmmaker from New York contacted Angela about producing a feature on Vivian's story. Eleanor agreed to participate on one condition, that the film focused not on the monetary value of the collection, but on the families. She wanted the audience to see the faces of the people who received their grandparents' wedding rings back. She wanted them to hear Miriam Rothstein-Carr describe what it felt like to stand in front of a painting her grandmother had loved and lost 80 years ago. The film was completed the following autumn and screened at 3 festivals before airing on public television to an audience of 2 million viewers. Eleanor lived on the mountain. She lived there through the winter, when the snow lay heavy on the hemlocks and the creek froze silent under a skin of clouded ice. She lived there through the spring, when the dogwoods bloomed white along the ridge and the cardinals, her cardinals, returned to nest in the branches above the porch. She lived there through the summer, when the garden she planted in the cleared ground behind the house produced tomatoes so abundant she gave the extras to Helen at the diner in Marlinton, who made salsa and brought jars of it back tied with gingham ribbon, a gesture that made Eleanor laugh for the first time in longer than she could remember. Clay Bosley checked on her every other day. Angela Bosley handled her legal affairs with quiet efficiency. The staff at Sycamore Ridge sent her a card on her birthday, signed by the nurses who had known her. Chester the therapy dog had been adopted by a resident named Dorothy, who Eleanor was told spoiled him terribly with biscuits from the snack cart. Karen called in February. The conversation was short, careful, and ended with Karen saying she was sorry. Eleanor said thank you. It was not reconciliation, but it was a beginning, and Eleanor had learned that beginnings could arrive at any age. Dennis called in April. He didn't say much. He asked if she needed anything. She told him she had everything she needed. He said he was glad, and Eleanor believed him, because Dennis had always been the quietest of her children and the one most likely to mean exactly what he said. Gerald did not call. He sent a letter, handwritten, 3 pages long. Eleanor read it once, folded it, and placed it in the fireproof lockbox with the photograph of Vivian and the brass key. She did not read it again, but she did not throw it away. Some things needed to stay sealed for a while before they could be opened. On a warm evening in late September, a full year after she had walked out of Sycamore Ridge and climbed the mountain, Eleanor sat on her porch in the rocking chair and watched the sun drop behind the western ridge. The sky turned from gold to rose to a deep, luminous violet that seemed to hold the last of the light the way a cupped hand holds water. The forest below was a rolling sea of green and amber, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cooling earth and the first faint edge of autumn. The cellar doors were closed now, fitted with a new frame and a proper lock, but Eleanor had asked Clay to leave the old wooden doors in place beneath the new ones. The scratched numbers, 1944, were still visible if you knew where to look. She wanted them there. She wanted the date to remain, not as a secret, but as a marker, a reminder that the most important things in this life are often the ones buried deepest, guarded longest, and dismissed by everyone who lacked the patience to look. Eleanor held the brass key in her open palm. She did not need it anymore. The lock it had opened was a formality. The real lock had been the silence, the years, the assumption by everyone around her that she was too old, too frail, too finished to hold anything of value. Her mother had known better. Vivian Hartwell had looked at the world and decided that the safest place for what mattered most was in the hands of someone everyone else would overlook. An old woman on a mountain. A sealed cellar beneath a house no one wanted. A key hidden in a pillowcase in a room that smelled of boiled carrots and industrial bleach. The sealed ground had opened. What it held had gone home. And Eleanor Whitfield, 78 years old, sitting on her mother's land in a chair she had chosen, In a house she had reclaimed, watching the stars appear one by one above the ancient pines was exactly where she was supposed to be. The door that had been locked was open now. She intended to keep it that way. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. Stories like this one remind us that the most important doors haven't been opened yet. If this moved you, there are more stories waiting for you on your screen right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time. I don't want you to miss what's coming. See you in the next story.